I thought the worst part of that night was being laughed at by my husband's friends. I was wrong. The worst part was hearing my own husband laugh with them. When one man asked if I could cook, I gave the only answer I had left. Cooking is easier than landing a Blackhawk in a sandstorm. The table went silent. Then, across the room, an old general turned toward me like he had just heard a ghost say her own name. Before we begin, comment the city you're watching from, and if this story speaks to your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The rain in Charleston that night was soft enough to seem polite, the kind of late autumn rain that did not fall so much as settle over everything. It made the old stone sidewalks shine under the street lamps and turned the windows of the historic homes into blurred squares of gold. I remember watching those reflections from the passenger seat of Michael's car, my hands folded in my lap, my wedding ring catching little flashes of light every time we passed beneath a lamp. Michael was talking about the people who would be there, about donors, developers, investors, men with family names printed on buildings, and women who knew how to smile without giving anything away. I nodded when I was supposed to. After 20 years of marriage, I had become very good at nodding at the right places. The party was being held at the home of one of Michael's business partners, a 3-story house near the Battery, with white columns, gas lanterns, and a driveway full of cars that looked too expensive to be parked in the rain. Michael worked in high-end real estate, and nights like this mattered to him. He had said so twice while choosing his tie. "These are the kind of rooms where deals start before anyone admits they're deals," he told me. I had smiled then, because that was easier than asking what kind of room I was supposed to be in. Inside, the house smelled of polished wood, white wine, and expensive candles. People stood in small circles beneath chandeliers, laughing in low, confident voices. I could feel the atmosphere before anyone said a word to me. It was the kind of room where everyone quietly measured everyone else. Clothes, posture, accent, jewelry, usefulness. Michael's hand rested lightly at my back as he guided me from one introduction to another. "This is my wife, Rebecca," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Rebecca used to be in the army. Used to be in the army." The words landed softly enough that no one else would notice the damage. I noticed. I always noticed. He did not say Captain Rebecca Carter. He did not say Blackhawk pilot. He did not say I had flown through places most of the men in that room could not have located on a map without looking at their phones. He made my past sound like a summer job, something dusty and distant, something I had outgrown before becoming more presentable as his wife. I looked at him while he spoke, wondering if he knew what he had erased, or if erasing me had become so natural that it no longer required effort. At dinner, I was seated between Michael and a woman who spent most of the meal discussing kitchen renovations. Across from us sat Blake Henderson and Doug Miller, though everyone called him Duke. They were both friends of Michael's, both loud in the way men become loud when they are certain the room belongs to them. Blake had the smooth, amused expression of someone who had rarely been interrupted in his life. Duke laughed before jokes were finished, especially when the jokes were cruel enough to make someone else smaller. At first, their comments were harmless on the surface. They teased Michael about finally bringing me out of hiding. They asked whether I enjoyed all the army discipline at home. Someone joked that Michael must never be late for dinner. I smiled because silence can look like grace when people are not paying attention. But inside, I felt something old begin to tighten. Not anger exactly. Anger would have been cleaner. This was something heavier, the weight of being translated into a version of myself that fit better beside my husband. Then Blake leaned back in his chair, swirled the wine in his glass, and looked at me with a grin that was already expecting applause. "So, Rebecca," he said, "can you cook?" The table laughed before I answered. Michael laughed too, not loudly, but enough. That was the part that touched the deepest place. Not Blake, not Duke, Michael. My husband, who knew just enough of my past to know that the question was not funny, and not enough of my pain to stop laughing. For a few seconds, I looked down at the white plate in front of me. There was a smear of sauce near the edge, carefully placed, like everything else in that house. I thought of all the years I had spent letting people assume less because correcting them felt like too much work. I thought of the woman I had been before I learned how to become convenient. Then I lifted my eyes and said, quietly, "Cooking is easier than landing a Black Hawk in a sandstorm." The laughter stopped so quickly it felt like someone had closed a door. Blake blinked. Duke's smile froze halfway across his face. Michael turned toward me, his expression caught between confusion and warning, as if I had broken some private rule we had never admitted existed. For the people at the table, it was probably just a strange answer, maybe an awkward joke from a woman they had underestimated. But across the room, near the tall windows where rain traced silver lines down the glass, an older man had gone completely still. He had silver hair, broad shoulders, and the kind of posture that did not come from wealth, it came from command. His eyes were fixed on me now, not with curiosity, but recognition. And when I saw his face clearly, I knew before anyone said his name. He was retired Lieutenant General Robert Hayes. For the rest of the dinner, I could feel the room trying to recover from what I had said. People went back to their wine, their polite laughter, their careful little stories about vacations and renovations. But something had shifted. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused anyone of being rude. I had simply answered a question honestly, and somehow honesty had made the table uncomfortable. Michael barely spoke to me through dessert. His smile stayed in place when others looked at him, but I knew the tightness in his jaw. I had seen it before, usually after I said something he thought was too direct, too serious, too inconvenient for the version of us he preferred to present. By the time people began standing and drifting toward the front hall, I had convinced myself that the older man near the window had only been staring because my comment had sounded strange. I wanted to believe that. I wanted the night to end cleanly, with rain on the windshield and silence in the car, nothing more. But as Michael helped me with my coat, the man crossed the room with the steady, unhurried walk of someone who had spent a lifetime entering places without asking permission from fear. He stopped in front of me, not too close, not dramatic. His suit was dark, simple, and better fitted than most of the expensive ones in the room. Up close, I saw the lines around his eyes, the kind made less by age than by years of seeing too much and learning not to show it. He looked at Michael briefly, then back at me. "Were you Captain Rebecca Carter?" he asked. The question was so calm that for a moment I could not answer. It was not the name that startled me. It was the rank, Captain. No one in Michael's world called me that. No one at the charity luncheons or holiday parties or real estate dinners knew that word belonged to me. Even I had stopped using it inside my own head. Hearing it spoken aloud felt like hearing a door open in a house I thought had been boarded shut. My fingers tightened around the sleeve of my coat. "I was," I said, though my voice came out thinner than I intended. Michael turned toward me quickly. "Captain?" he repeated, as if the word had been hidden from him instead of softened by him for years. The man did not look surprised by Michael's confusion. If anything, his expression grew quieter. "I'm Robert Hayes," he said. "Retired Lieutenant General." I knew the name before he finished saying it. Not personally, not exactly, but in the way people in aviation knew certain names. Men like him moved through briefings, command chains, reports, ceremonies. Their names appeared on papers that decided where people flew and where they did not come back from. My mouth went dry. General Hayes studied my face as though he was matching the woman in front of him to a memory that had stayed sharp while everything else had aged. "Kandahar," he said softly. 2011. The front hall, the polished floors, the sound of rain against the porch, Michael's hand near my elbow, everything seemed to pull back from me. For 1 second, I was not in Charleston anymore. I heard rotor blades cutting through thick, dirty air. I saw red-brown dust rising so hard it swallowed the landing zone. I felt the radio crackle in my ear, broken voices pushing through static, coordinates repeated, warnings clipped short. I remembered the taste of grit between my teeth and the terrible discipline of keeping my hands steady when every nerve in my body understood how wrong the sky had become. Fear had been there. Of course it had. But fear was something we folded and put away, because there was no room for it in the cockpit. I must have gone pale. because Michael touched my arm and said, "Rebecca?" His voice sounded far away. General Hayes noticed, and something in his face softened. He did not ask me to explain. He did not perform respect for the people watching us from across the hall. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed me a business card. "I don't want to do this here," he said, "but we need to speak." I turned the card over without meaning to, and on the back, in neat blue ink, he had written, "We need to talk about Kandahar 2011. For a long moment, I stared at those words as if they were not words at all, but a flare shot into a dark place I had spent years avoiding. Michael leaned close enough to read them. "Is this about something official?" he asked, too lightly. General Hayes gave him a measured look. "It's about something overdue," he said. Then he nodded to me, once, with a kind of solemn recognition that felt more intimate than comfort, and walked back into the fading noise of the party. The drive home was worse than an argument. Michael tried to make the whole thing smaller before it could become real. He said Hayes might have mistaken me for someone else. Then he said older military men sometimes exaggerated stories after retirement. Then, after several blocks of rain and silence, he laughed under his breath and said, "I mean, Becca, you never made it sound like some kind of movie." I looked out at the wet streets and did not answer. That was the thing he had never understood. I had not wanted it to sound like a movie. I had wanted it to stop sounding like anything at all. But the card was in my purse, and even without touching it, I could feel its weight. Something old had opened in me, not violently, not all at once, but enough that I knew sleep would not come easily. Later, after Michael went upstairs and the house settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, I stood in front of the hall closet for almost 10 minutes before reaching to the top shelf. Behind winter scarves and a box of Christmas candles was a small wooden case I had not opened in years. I carried it to the kitchen table. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were my flight wings, a faded photograph of my crew, and a few small pieces of a life I had hidden so well that even I had begun to act as if it had belonged to someone else. I did not sleep much that night. The wooden case stayed open on the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, its contents arranged beneath the soft yellow light like evidence from another woman's life. My flight wings looked smaller than I remembered, but the weight of them in my palm felt almost unbearable. The photograph was faded at the edges, the faces younger, sharper, sunburned, and tired, all of us standing beside the aircraft with our shoulders squared against a wind none of us could control. I touched the corner of the picture and felt a strange sadness rise in me. Not only for what had happened back then, but for how completely I had allowed that woman to disappear. By morning, I was still sitting with the same question. When had I stopped correcting people? It had not happened all at once. Michael had never ordered me to be quiet about my service. He had never forbidden me from mentioning the army, never asked me directly to hide the rank, the aircraft, the missions, the part of me that had once lived by checklists, radio calls, discipline, and nerve. That would have been easier to name. What happened between us was softer than that, and maybe that was why it lasted so long. It came in little adjustments, little edits, little moments when he shortened my history to make it easier for other people to swallow. At company dinners, when someone asked what I had done before we married, Michael would say, "Rebecca was in logistics for a while," even though he knew that was only a sliver of the truth. At neighborhood gatherings, if someone pressed a little further, he would smile and say, "She flew a little in the army," as if flying a Black Hawk was the same as taking lessons on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He was not exactly lying. That was the part that made it difficult. He was trimming, softening, sanding down the edges of my life until it fit more comfortably inside his. For years, I told myself it did not matter. I had left that world. I had chosen marriage, a home, routines, charity breakfasts, Christmas cards, quiet weekends, polite conversations with people who thought bravery belonged in boardrooms and risk was something men discussed over bourbon. I sat beside Michael at long tables and listened to men like Blake and Duke talk about bold decisions, high-pressure negotiations, impossible deadlines, and the courage it took to gamble millions of dollars on the right property. I smiled at the right moments. I asked questions when the silence needed filling. I let them believe I was impressed, because being easy to place made the evening easier for everyone. Sometimes, when one of them used words like pressure or danger, I would feel something inside me lift its head. Not pride, exactly, more like memory. But then Michael would squeeze my hand under the table, or change the subject, or tell a story about a deal he had saved at the last minute, and I would fold that part of myself away again. I had become skilled at disappearing without leaving the room. That was the truth I did not want to face as I stood in the kitchen the next morning, washing a coffee mug I had already washed twice. Michael was not a villain. He was affectionate when life was calm. He remembered my mother's birthday. He brought me soup when I had the flu. He could be generous, charming, thoughtful in ways that made it hard to accuse him of anything cleanly. But he also needed to be admired. He needed rooms to turn toward him. And somewhere along the way, I had learned that the easiest way to love him was to take up less space. When I told him after breakfast that I planned to call General Hayes, Michael looked up from his phone as if I had said something unreasonable. "Already?" he asked. "You don't even know what he wants. I said that was exactly why I needed to call." He leaned back in his chair, wearing the careful expression he used when trying not to sound controlling. "I just don't want you getting pulled into something uncomfortable," he said. "Those old military things can get complicated." I almost laughed, but there was no humor in me. Old military things. That was how he spoke of the years that had shaped me before he ever knew me. "It's my past, Michael," I said. "I think I'm allowed to know why someone came looking for me." His face tightened just slightly. "No one came looking for you," he said. The man heard a comment at a party. There it was again, the instinct to make it smaller. Not cruelly, not loudly, but firmly enough to remind me that my version of events was inconvenient to his peace. I looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man I had loved for 20 years, and for the first time in a long while, I wondered how much of our peace had been built from my silence. Michael glanced toward the wooden case, still open beside me, and his discomfort became impossible to miss. It was not only that he did not understand my past, it was that he seemed afraid of what might happen if other people began to understand it. If General Hayes said my name out loud, if Kandahar stepped back into the room, if the woman Michael had edited for 2 decades suddenly stood at full height, then everyone might look at us differently. Worse than that, Michael might have to look at me differently too. I called General Hayes the next morning before I could talk myself out of it. My voice sounded steadier than I felt when I left a message, but the moment I hung up, my hands went cold. For the rest of the day, I moved through ordinary tasks as if they belonged to someone else. I folded laundry, answered an email from the neighborhood association, and stood in the grocery store staring at a shelf of coffee as though choosing a bag of beans required courage. By late afternoon, he called back. His tone was respectful, direct, and careful in a way that made me understand he was not calling out of curiosity. We agreed to meet the following day at a quiet cafe near the Charleston harbor, one of those small places with fogged windows, wooden tables, and the smell of strong coffee clinging to the walls. The rain had stopped by then, but the city still looked damp, the sky low and silver over the water. I arrived 10 minutes early and nearly left twice before he walked in. General Hayes did not wear his rank anymore, but something about him still made people notice the space he entered. He ordered black coffee, thanked the woman behind the counter, and sat across from me without making the moment larger than it already was. For a while, we spoke like strangers, pretending not to be standing at the edge of something old. Then he placed a thin folder on the table between us. "The Kandahar mission from 2011 is under partial declassification review," he said. I stared at the folder. I did not touch it. "Why now?" I asked. "Because enough time has passed," he said, "and because some things should have been acknowledged long before now." He explained that the Military Aviation Heritage Foundation was preparing a ceremony to recognize several people connected to that operation. Not every detail could be made public, not every name, not every decision, but enough had cleared the review process for the Foundation to honor the mission and the people whose actions had kept others alive. "They want you there," he said. "They want to recognize you." My first reaction was not pride. It was almost panic. I looked toward the window, where a line of gulls moved above the gray water, and I felt my throat tighten. "I left that life," I said. "A long time ago." He did not interrupt. That made it harder. "I have a house now, a husband, a completely different world. I'm not that person anymore." General Hayes watched me with a patience that felt almost painful. Then he said, "You didn't stop being her. You only stopped saying her name." I hated him a little for that sentence, not because it was cruel, but because it reached past every explanation I had built and touched the truth underneath. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup and let the heat press into my palms. He began to speak about Kandahar, but not like a man telling a war story. He spoke carefully, keeping away from details that were still not his to give, and from memories that did not need to be dragged into the light for effect. He reminded me of the weather that night, the dust that turned distance into guesswork, the broken reports coming through the radio, the uncertainty about how many were still waiting on the ground. He did not describe heroism the way civilians sometimes did, as if courage meant not being afraid. He knew better. He knew courage was sometimes nothing more glamorous than doing the next necessary thing with your hands steady enough to save someone else's life. "There are men alive because of the decision you made," he said. I looked down before he could see my eyes fill. "There were a lot of people involved," I said. "Yes," he answered, "and you were one of them." That was the part I had spent years avoiding. I could honor everyone else in my memory. I could name the crew, the medics, the people on the ground, the ones who gave orders and the ones who followed them under impossible conditions. But I had removed myself from the story, as if modesty required disappearance. General Hayes slid the folder closer, but still did not force it into my hands. "No one is asking you to relive everything," he said. "But you have the right to stand in the room when your name is spoken." When I got home, Michael was at the kitchen island with his laptop open, smiling at something on the screen. He looked energized, almost boyish, the way he did when a deal began to tilt in his favor. "You won't believe this," he said. "Carter and Whitmore is listed as a major sponsor for the Military Aviation Heritage Foundation dinner next month. This could be a big visibility moment for us." I stood very still near the doorway. The words seemed to arrange themselves in the air between us, before he understood what they meant. He did not understand, of course. Not yet. He was already talking about client tables, press coverage, the guest list, the kind of people who might be there. He said the foundation was honoring some aviation people from an old mission overseas, and he hoped the program would be tasteful, because events like that could be good for the brand if handled right. I listened to my husband speak with excitement about a ceremony built around a history he had spent years making smaller. I thought about telling him then. I could have said, "Michael, that old mission is mine." I could have put General Hayes's folder on the counter and watched his face change, but I didn't. Not because I wanted revenge. Revenge would have been too simple, and my feelings were not simple anymore. I stayed quiet because, for once, I wanted to know whether Michael would become curious on his own. I wanted to know if he would ask what General Hayes had said, what Kandahar meant to me, why my hands had trembled when I came home. Instead, he kept talking about the sponsor table, and I let him. The evening of the ceremony, the rain returned to Charleston as if it had never really left. It fell lightly over the streets, silver and steady, softening the edges of the old buildings and turning every passing headlight into a long ribbon of light. I sat beside Michael in the car with my hands folded over my clutch, feeling the small, hard shape of General Hayes's business card still tucked inside. I did not need to bring it. I already knew what waited for me. But carrying it made the night feel real, as if that little card had become a bridge between the woman I had hidden and the woman I was about to be asked to stand as. Michael was in a bright mood. He had chosen his Navy suit, the one he wore when he wanted to look successful without appearing to try. He talked through the guest list, mentioned 2 developers, a retired judge, and a foundation board member he hoped to meet. "This is exactly the kind of room Carter and Whitmore needs to be seen in," he said, glancing at himself in the dark reflection of the window. I looked at him and wondered whether he had noticed I had barely spoken since we left the house. He had not asked how I felt. He had not asked what General Hayes and I had discussed. In a way, his not asking had become its own answer. The hall was warmer than I expected, full of amber light and low conversation, with white tablecloths, polished silver, framed photographs of aircraft along the walls, and old uniforms moving slowly through the crowd, like pieces of history, still breathing. Men and women with service pins stood near the entrance, speaking quietly, their faces carrying the calm weight of people who did not need to prove what they had survived. I felt my chest tighten the moment we stepped inside. This was not Michael's usual world, even if he believed any formal room could become his if he smiled correctly. This room had a different gravity. People were not measuring each other by watches or contracts. They were measuring something quieter. Blake Henderson and Duke Miller found us before we reached our table. Blake clapped Michael on the shoulder and said something about the sponsor placement, looking excellent near the front of the program. Duke gave me a quick smile, not cruel this time, but careless, as if the dinner party had never happened, or had already been folded into the category of things women were expected to let go. "Big night for your company," Blake said to Michael. "Good crowd." Michael stood a little taller. "That's the hope," he replied. "A strong cause, strong visibility." I listened to him use the word visibility and felt something inside me go very still. A young volunteer handed each of us a printed program. Michael took his without looking at it at first. He was still talking to Blake, still scanning the room for important faces. I held mine unopened in both hands. I already knew the words were there. General Hayes had warned me the final program would list my name plainly. No dramatic reveal had been planned, no attempt to embarrass anyone. The truth was simply printed where it belonged. Then Michael finally glanced down. I saw the change before he spoke. His smile weakened first. Then his eyes stopped moving. His thumb pressed against the paper, and the color in his face shifted. Blake, noticing, leaned over his shoulder. Duke did too. For a few seconds, all three men stared at the same two lines. Guest of honor, Captain Rebecca Carter. Black Hawk pilot, Kandahar mission, 2011. I had imagined that moment more than once in the days leading up to the ceremony. I had imagined satisfaction, maybe even vindication. I thought I might feel some sharp little pleasure watching Blake and Duke lose their arrogance, watching Michael understand what he had failed to see. But when it happened, there was no triumph in me, only a deep, tired sadness. It hurt to realize that my husband needed a printed program, a formal title, a foundation dinner, and a retired general to recognize the full shape of the woman standing beside him. Michael turned toward me slowly. "Rebecca," he said, but my name sounded different in his mouth now, heavier, unfamiliar. I did not rescue him from the silence. I did not explain. Across the room, General Hayes stepped onto the stage, and the conversations gradually faded. He stood at the podium with the same steady restraint he had carried in the cafe. When he spoke about Kandahar, he did not make it sound like a movie. He did not turn fear into spectacle or service into performance. He spoke of a difficult mission, of decisions made under pressure, of a crew that did what needed to be done when conditions were against them. He spoke with gratitude, not drama. Then he said my name. Captain Rebecca Carter. The room rose before I fully understood it was happening. Chair legs shifted. Hands came together. The applause filled the hall, not wild, not theatrical, but strong enough to move through me like something I had been holding back for years. I stood because General Hayes turned toward me, and because there was nowhere left to hide. For the first time in a very long time, I heard my name not as an addition to Michael's, not as a polite introduction, not as a softened version of a life someone else found easier to accept. I heard it as mine. I heard it as whole. The applause did not end when I stepped down from the stage. Not really. It followed me through the rest of the evening in quieter forms. A woman touching my arm as I passed, an older veteran nodding once from across the room, A young officer looking at me as if I had given her permission to stand taller. I accepted handshakes, photographs, careful words of gratitude, and through all of it, I could feel Michael beside me without needing to look. His silence had changed. Before, his silence had often been a way of managing me, smoothing me down, waiting for me to return to the version of myself he knew how to handle. That night, his silence felt like a man standing in a room whose walls had moved while he was not paying attention. After the dinner ended and people began drifting toward the exits, Michael stopped me near the side hallway, away from the sponsor tables and the framed photographs. His face looked older than it had when we arrived. "Rebecca," he said, and for once he did not shorten my name. "I'm sorry. I wanted those words to feel like relief. For years, I had imagined that if Michael ever truly saw what he had done, an apology would open something soft in me. But standing there under the warm hallway lights, with my name still echoing somewhere behind us, I realized an apology was not a key. It was only a beginning. "For what?" I asked. He looked startled, almost hurt, as if the answer should have been obvious. "For tonight," he said. "For the party. For Blake and Duke. For not knowing." I shook my head slowly. "The pain isn't only one dinner party, Michael. It isn't only one stupid question about cooking. It's 20 years of watching you let people misunderstand me because it made your life easier. It's 20 years of you making my service sound smaller, softer, less important, so it wouldn't change the way people looked at you." He swallowed and looked away. "I didn't mean to do that." His voice was quiet, almost pleading. And maybe that was true. Maybe he had not sat down one day and decided to erase me. Maybe he had only chosen comfort over honesty so many times that it became a habit. "Some wounds don't need intention to be real," I said. "You didn't have to mean it for it to hurt." He had no answer for that. Neither did I. We stood there for a moment, two people married for 20 years and suddenly unfamiliar to each other in a new way. Blake and Duke found me near the coat check 10 minutes later. They looked like men who had rehearsed an apology in the restroom and still did not trust it to come out right. Blake cleared his throat first. "Rebecca, I owe you an apology," he said. "That comment the other night was out of line." Duke nodded too quickly. "Yeah, we were just joking around, but we shouldn't have." I looked at both of them and felt none of the anger I expected. Their embarrassment no longer felt like something I needed. "Thank you," I said. That was all. I did not absolve them. I did not give them a gracious speech to make them feel better. I did not pretend their apology repaired anything. I simply accepted it and turned back toward the door. I did not need Blake or Duke to bow their heads. I only needed to stop living as if men like them were the audience I had to please. In the weeks that followed, the ceremony did not fade the way I thought it might. General Hayes sent me the name of a local women veterans group that met twice a month in a church community room not far from West Ashley. I nearly deleted the message. Then, on a Thursday evening, I drove there alone. I sat in my car for 12 minutes before going inside. That was where I met Linda Morales, a former Army nurse with silver-threaded dark hair and a laugh that carried more warmth than volume. She did not ask me to tell my story right away. She only handed me coffee in a paper cup and said, "You'd be surprised how many of us came home and made ourselves smaller so other people could stay comfortable." I looked at her, and something in me loosened. In that room, there were women who had served as pilots, medics, mechanics, officers, drivers, translators, and nurses. Some had marriages that survived. Some did not. Some had children who had never heard the full truth. Some had spent years letting their families treat their service like an awkward footnote. For the first time, I understood that my silence had not been unique, but it had still been mine to break. Michael did begin to change after that, but slowly, in uneven human ways. At a charity lunch, I heard him say, "My wife, Rebecca, was a Black Hawk pilot." The words sounded careful, as if he was learning a language he should have spoken years ago. At home, he asked about Kandahar once and did not interrupt when I answered. He stopped laughing when other men made small jokes at my expense. He began to notice the moments where he had once looked away. I saw the effort, and I did not dismiss it. But I also stopped making his growth the measure of my worth. Whether Michael became the husband I needed or not, I had already begun returning to myself. Healing did not arrive in our house like a sunrise. It came in smaller, less graceful ways. It came in the pauses before Michael answered questions he used to rush through. It came in the way he stopped introducing me, as if my past were a delicate inconvenience. It came in the awkward evenings when he asked something real, then sat with the answer even when it made him uncomfortable. We were not suddenly the kind of couple people write about in anniversary cards. There were still mornings when the silence between us felt bruised. There were still moments when I looked at him across the kitchen and wondered how many years of myself I had surrendered without naming it. But something had changed. The truth had entered our home, and once it was there, neither of us could politely move around it anymore. For a long time, my flight wings had lived in that wooden case on the top shelf of the hall closet, behind scarves, old candles, and the kind of things people keep but rarely touch. A few days after my second meeting with the Women Veterans Group, I took them out again. This time, I did not sit at the kitchen table like someone opening evidence. I carried them into my small office, cleared a space beside the lamp, and placed them on the desk where morning light could find them. They looked different there, not hidden, not displayed for applause, just present. Michael stood in the doorway when I did it. He did not say much. Maybe he understood finally that some moments did not need his commentary. After a while, he said, "They should have been there a long time ago." I looked at the wings, not at him. "Yes," I said. That was all. It was not cruel. It was not forgiveness either. It was simply the truth. And for once, the truth did not have to soften itself. Linda Morales asked me to speak at one of the group's monthly gatherings in early December. My first instinct was to refuse, even after the ceremony, even after the applause, even after hearing my name spoken in a room full of people who understood service. A part of me still wanted to step backward. Old habits do not vanish because one night makes them visible. I told Linda I was not sure I had anything helpful to say. She smiled like she had heard that sentence from 100 women before me. "Then start there," she said. So I did. I stood in a church community room with folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, and rain tapping lightly against the windows again, because Charleston seemed determined to keep weather in my story. I looked at the women in front of me: pilots, nurses, mechanics, medics, officers, mothers, widows, wives, divorced women, women who had rebuilt themselves more than once, and I did not speak like a hero. I did not tell the story of Kandahar as if I had been fearless. I told them about silence. I told them about letting other people make my life easier to understand by making it smaller. I told them about the dinner party, the laughter, the question about cooking, and the strange grief of realizing that a room full of strangers had not hurt me as deeply as the years I had spent helping them misunderstand me. No one interrupted. No one rushed to comfort me. They listened in the way people listen when they recognize a wound by its shape. Afterward, a woman I did not know squeezed my hand and said she had not worn her dress uniform in 15 years. Another told me her children thought she had only worked in an office overseas because that was easier than explaining the rest. I drove home that night with a quietness inside me I had not felt in years. It was not happiness, exactly. It was steadier than that. Michael was awake when I came in. He asked how it went, and when I told him, he listened. Not perfectly, not without the old instinct to fix things rising in his face, but he listened. That was where we were then, not repaired, not ruined, but honest enough to begin from a different place. I no longer believed that love required me to disappear. I no longer believed peace was worth the cost of being unnamed in my own life. The truth was, the problem had never really been Blake asking whether I could cook. It had never been only Duke laughing or Michael smiling when he should have stopped it. The deeper problem was that somewhere along the way, I had started living as if the largest parts of me were a burden other people should not have to carry. I know better now. I do not need revenge against the people who underestimated me. I only need to stop helping them do it. And from that day forward, when someone asked who I was, I did not lower my voice. I said it clearly. My name is Rebecca Carter. I was a captain. I flew Black Hawks, and I am still here. I have learned that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes God sends them quietly, through a name spoken at the right moment, a door we thought was closed, or the courage to finally stand in our own truth. In everyday life, we may be mothers, wives, neighbors, caregivers, or simply tired souls trying to make it through another day. But none of us should have to become smaller to make others comfortable. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. Leave a comment about the part that stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories of courage, healing, and quiet strength. May God bless you, protect your home, and remind you every day that your story still matters.